Hello and welcome to another episode of Tenancy Matters in BC. My name is Shirin Saleh. I'm the owner of 88 West Realty. I'm here with Jaden Hildebrand. He is our property manager. Today we are going to talk about the loss of rental income and damages that a tenant may claim at the end of the tenancy, or if the tenancy is broken by the tenant. All our discussions will be based on policy guideline number 3 and number 4. So let's dive into the topic. So Jaden, let's start with a basic question. What exactly policy guideline number 3 and 4 talk about?
That's a great question. This RTB policy guideline is in place to address situations where a landlord may seek to hold a tenant liable for rent loss and other losses incurred due to lack of payment or if the tenant breaks the lease. These guidelines help clarify how landlords can handle these disputes, and it sort of ensures fairness when handling these disputes.
So Jaden, you mentioned loss of rental income, and so for unpaid rent. What is the difference between unpaid rent and overholding?
So unpaid rent refers to the money that is owed during the tenancy, typically rent that is not paid on time. Damages for overholding, it happens when the tenant stays beyond the end of the agreement. While unpaid rent can be ordered, damages for overholding is filed completely separately and handled in a completely different way.
Okay, so can you explain a little bit more about what overholding means?
Overholding is specifically when the tenant stays there beyond the end of the lease agreement, and then the owner cannot rent it out again. The tenant is then liable for the damages to the owner, such as their loss of their rent, or even if a new tenant needs to move in and the tenant and the owner cannot rent to them, and now they're liable to compensation to the new tenants who are unable to move in.
So in an overholding instance or case, is the tenant liable to pay for the rent of the whole month? Say if a tenant stays in the rental unit after the tenancy agreement is terminated for 2 or 3 days or 1 week, is the tenant liable to pay for the whole month or just for per diem?
Yes, it's actually just based on a per diem basis until the owner reclaims possession of the rental unit.
Okay.
Now, Shirin, do you know what happens if a tenant leaves or vacates a property before the end of the tenancy agreement? If they, say, abandon the property or leave it right before the end?
Well, hopefully it doesn't happen. However, because of the life situation changes, and then sometimes the tenants, they have to move out. Sometimes they get another job, or they need to change the city, or for a cause they have to break the lease. In that case, the moment that the tenant sends a notice to vacate to end the tenancy agreement to the landlord, the landlord has the duty to start advertising and to advertising the property for rent, and also to minimize the loss of rental income. So the landlords, they have to keep the proof of their acts, whatever they have done, whether they have hired a property manager like you, or whether they want to do it voluntarily themselves. So they have to show the proof that right after they've received the notice, they started advertising for the unit. So in that case, if say a tenant is moving out by end of the month, and by the way, the tenants should give 1 full month notice to the landlord. 1 full month. So it doesn't mean 1 full month from if they're giving a notice at 4th of April and then by 4th of May they are leaving. No, that's not considered 1 full month. And a full month, correct me if I'm wrong, should start from the day that they pay the rent. Rent is payable by the 1st of the month, so they have to give 1 full month from the 1st of the month. It gives the landlord enough time to find another tenant and to mitigate the risk of losing rental income.
Absolutely. So let's unpack this a bit further. How should a landlord, or how does a landlord find out that the tenant has abandoned the unit, for example?
Great point. Abandonment has got its own laws and regulations. Actually, it's more complicated than when a tenant leaves. So a landlord is responsible to find out through different avenues whether the property has been abandoned or not, meaning by calling the tenant, texting, going to, if it is a strata, speaking with the neighbors, and then just making sure that the property, whether the tenant is living there or the property has been abandoned. So the very first stage is the landlord should make sure that the tenant has abandoned the property, tenant does not live there. Then the landlord can enter the property, and then there are certain procedures that the landlord should follow in order to make sure that the belongings of the tenant, if there are any, and will be taken care of. Now, also with regards to the belongings, according to the bylaws and the tenancy RTB, if the value of the properties and belongings of the tenant is worth $500 or less, so the landlord is allowed to just throw them out, is not required to store them. However, if the properties, if the belongings are, the values are more than $500, say $2,000, $5,000, $10,000, the landlord should hire a moving company and they should store them.
Wow.
At least, yeah, it's a lot of cost for at least 60 days in a safe place for 60 days, and try to reach out the tenant and give the tenant the information about the storage, where the property, where the belongings are kept. And after 60 days, if the landlord does not hear from the tenant, then the landlord is allowed to auction them, to sell them, to use them, and then to use towards covering the loss of rental income and probably damages as well. The cost of moving and storage, it's a lot of work, and hopefully it never happens for any landlord. Jaden, now that we have covered a little bit briefly about the abandoned properties, let's shift gears. Now let's focus on the step-by-step procedure of recovering loss of rental income and also the damages. Could you please walk us through?
Landlords should minimize their damages when a tenant breaks their lease or abandons the property. They must take reasonable steps to mitigate their losses, such as re-renting the property as soon as possible at a fair market price. They cannot re-rent it at an inflated higher price or even sell the property. These aren't considered reasonable.
Now, Jaden, can I interrupt you? Sorry for a moment. You said that they cannot advertise or rent the property at a higher price, can't?
Well, I believe that's an inflated price, as in a higher price. Yeah,
okay.
unreasonable.
Yeah.
So that way someone won't take it. That way they can keep charging the current tenant.
Correct. Okay. So in a way, anything that would delay renting the property, anything that would delay renting the property is not considered as reasonable act.
Yeah.
So when they go to the RTB, then the arbitrator will not accept that.
Of course.
Okay. Got it.
The goal is just usually act as quickly and efficiently as possible.
Okay. So my next question is, you talked about loss of rental income, and then the landlord's responsibility to mitigate the risk, the loss of rental income. But then the next question is, what if the rental unit is not rentable anymore? What if the tenant has caused a lot of damages to the property? So what should the landlord do?
Well, they can claim the loss of rent due to damage or poor condition. If the tenant leaves the property in such a condition that it makes it impossible to rent out beyond wear and tear, which we've already talked about, the landlord can claim compensation not only for repairs and cleaning, but also for the rent that they've lost out of while the property was unrentable. But just like all other damages, the owner has to do their best to mitigate their losses.
Perfect. Now, another question that just came to my mind is, so how should or who is responsible to prove the damages?
Always the landlord.
The landlord.
Always the landlord. Document everything.
Okay, that was a good point. Now, what if the tenant, and then obviously if they do a move-out inspection, so together with the tenant and landlord, they can document the condition of the property. What if the tenant does not want to participate in move-out inspection?
Well, either way, they're going to have to sign for it. They're going to have to sign. But regardless, the owner will take photos of everything prior to the move-in, and then they will have the CRA document where they will sign everything and put the condition down. And
I'm sorry, what do you mean by CRA?
the CRA is the, or I believe it's called, well, at least at Swift we call it CRA. It's the
Condition?
yeah, the condition inspection report.
Okay. Condition.
CIR.
Yeah.
CRA.
CRA. Okay.
CIR.
So we're gonna start this part again, or maybe we shouldn't. Unnecessary. What if I said? What if did? Can you listen to the last part? I forgot what I was saying.
Okay. So ideally, the landlord will and the tenant will be there together for the move-out inspection. But if the tenant isn't there, the best case scenario is for the owner to have a witness there with them while they document all of the damages or just the condition of the unit during the move-out.
Okay, excellent. So I've been through this RTB. Okay, sorry. I don't want to say. You did mention about the witness. Witness is very important.
Ideally, the tenant would be there with the landlord for the move-out, but if not, worst case scenario, they will document everything and make sure that the owner should have a witness during the move-out to make sure the condition of the unit is good and to document any damages. I feel like I forgot the main thing that we just said.
You said it.
Was it?
Yes. Because my question is, what if they need to do a move-out inspection?
Ideally, if the tenant is there with the owner, but if the tenant isn't there for the move-out inspection, then the best case scenario for the owner is to get a witness for the move-out so they can document the condition of the unit, the damages, and then compare it all to the move-in on the CIR report, which is the condition and inspection report.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay. All right, Sharon, here's a tricky situation. If the landlord has to re-rent the property at a lower rate, can the owner charge damages to the tenant for the difference in the amount of the rent?
Well, according to, yes, RTB, and the answer is yes. Say if the rent used to be $2,000 and then the tenant breaks the lease for the next 5 months and the market condition is changed and the landlord rents that place for $1,800. Now the difference is $200 per month. So the landlord can claim for the rest of the 5 months of balance of the term of the tenancy agreement multiplied by 200. So the tenant can claim about $1,000 of lower rent because that's considered as loss of rental income. And then it's also on the reverse side. If the landlord is renting it at the rental unit at a higher rate, say if the rent was $2,000, now the new rent is $2,300. The difference is $300. Now what happens with this difference? Multiplied by 5 months, it would be $1,500. Now, if the landlord makes any claim of loss of rental income and damages, that $1,500, the rent difference, will be counted towards the loss of damages, so it will be deducted.
Oh, wow.
Say if the landlord is claiming $3,000 loss of rental income and damages from the tenant, the $1,500 will be cut from $3,000. So the landlord is entitled to receive only $1,500.
Okay.
Yeah. Jaden, now let's dive into another key topic which is discussed in Policy Guideline 3 and 4, and that's liquidated damages versus penalty. Now, what is exactly liquidated damages versus penalty?
So liquidated damages is a clause where the landlord and the tenant agree in advance on the amount payable if the tenant breaks the agreement, like ending the lease early. But it has to be a reasonable pre-estimate of loss. If it feels too high or like it feels like a punishment, it can be ruled as unenforceable.
Okay. RTB will not agree on any unreasonable amount requested from the tenant.
Exactly. Now, Sharon, if the liquidated damages clause is ruled as a penalty, does that mean the landlord can't recover any losses?
So the simple answer is no. The landlord is still entitled to to file with RTB and request the cost of that, the cost of loss of rental income and the cost of re-renting the unit, advertising, and also repairing the property from the tenant. So yes, RTB does not like to see the penalty, or they don't like to see that a landlord is asking unreasonable amount for a tenant. Everything has to be reasonable. But then don't worry if your tenancy agreement does not mention liquidated damages or penalty, you're still entitled to receive or recover the money from the tenant. So going back to the conversation of liquidated damages versus penalty, if a tenancy agreement includes the liquidated damages equal to loss of security deposit, for example, if the tenancy agreement says that if the tenant breaks the lease, the tenant is not entitled to receive the security deposit. Now, is that correct? Are we allowed to do so?
Not really, because that would usually be considered a penalty clause unless the amount matches the actual loss expected. Automatically keeping a security deposit for breaking the lease isn't valid unless it's a fair estimate of what the landlord's going to lose.
Actually, let's talk about an actual case. We had last week a tenant broke the lease, and then we spoke with the tenant that, okay, the tenant is responsible to pay the cost of re-renting the unit, which is the cost of hiring a property manager, plus advertising, plus cleaning the unit, and then plus the utilities, unpaid utilities, and plus the unpaid rent during the term that the property sits vacant. And obviously the tenant was not happy. Then we had to file with RTB, and then we'll leave it to the arbitrator and see what damages the arbitrator will agree that the tenant is liable to pay. But that's the general case for majority of the time that the tenant should consider if breaking the lease. Okay, and that is a wrap to our today's conversation about policy guideline 3 and 4, where a landlord requires to recover the loss of rental income, re-renting the property, and damages incurred to the property by a tenant.
Perfect. If you guys found this episode helpful, please like and subscribe. Leave us a comment. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them down, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. I'm Jaden, and this has been Tenancy Matters in BC. Keep your tenancy in check. So if you want to learn more, please look up the RTB website and see the decisions that they have made regarding tenancies in our area.